Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two while everybody enters. Okay, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, so we'll get started. Before we jump into content for tonight, I'm going to briefly outline who we are at Collegewise. And as we go through the slides, please use the Q&A button to post any questions that come up. We have a fabulous college counselor, Allie, who's based in Colorado, who's going to be addressing any of those questions as we go through the webinar. And then we will also answer some questions live at the end. Just a note, we are recording this presentation so you can get access to it if you'd like to reference it later or share it with friends and family. And we're going to launch a poll now just to get a sense of who is in attendance. Thanks. Stephanie, you want to go to the next slide? At Collegewise, we've been working with students through the college admissions process for over 20 years. We started in 1999 with one counselor and a handful of students, and now we've grown to over 60 counselors and 30 tutors working with thousands of students. Next slide. We work with students in college counseling, academic tutoring, and test prep as early as 8th grade. And our philosophy at Collegewise is to equip students and families with advice and knowledge to make informed decisions. That includes things like working together on building a student's overall profile, identifying what colleges to apply to and strategies on those applications, test prep, and curriculum tutoring. We believe that testing is a small piece of the much larger puzzle that is the college application. So I'm Nichelle Passanisi. I'm a Collegewise counselor here. I assist students in making the most of their high school journey and then applying to college. I'm based in Boise, Idaho, but that's actually a new location for me. Up until last summer, I spent my career working in the Bay Area in California. Before coming to Collegewise, I worked in admissions at a few different universities. I was director of admissions at a small private liberal arts university, and I was also an external application reader for UC Berkeley and UC San Diego. I was a college counselor at an independent high school for 6 years, doing this exact same work, but with just from the students from my one high school before I switched to independent counseling. And I really love being a small part of this momentous time in a student's life, the college search process. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I am the Dean of Tutoring and Test Prep. And what that means is that I oversee our tutoring and testing division. I help train the tutors, and I do take on a limited number of students to work with in preparation for exams and also just helping them out academically. I've been in the test prep world for a long time. I started many years ago after graduating the University of Virginia. I worked for one of the largest test prep organizations. So I've been doing this for the better part of 2 decades. I also worked at Rutgers University here in New Jersey. That's where I'm based. And so if you're coming to us from one of the local New Jersey libraries, thank you and welcome. And I really enjoyed discussing the different aspects of these tests, the ACT, the SAT, we even work on the ISEE, the SSAT, the AP exams. We also do some of the college level classes, which are the GRE and GMAT. So I look forward to sharing good information that I hope helps you in the next hour or so. And as Nichelle said, yes, please do drop your questions into the question box. If we don't get to them while we're talking, because we do have a lot of material to cover, we will certainly allow time at the end where we can answer some of your questions live. So what we are hoping to achieve today is talk about what the SAT and the ACT are, how they're different, which might be a better fit for you if you're a student joining us, or for your child if you're a parent. What are the AP exams and how do they fit into the college admissions process, if at all? We'll talk about good ways to prepare for these exams should you choose to move forward with taking them. And along those same lines, we're going to talk about what does test optional mean, test free, test required. So we've got a jam-packed agenda, and let's start. One of the things that I want to emphasize, and I sell test prep for a living, so I think this is somewhat indicative of Collegewise's philosophy, is that we don't let testing drive the admissions process for students. It really is a small piece of the puzzle, and it's becoming even smaller as the test optional movement has taken form over the last couple of years. One of the reasons why I think folks do focus on the tests is because it is somewhat quantifiable, right? You can see how much a student's scores improve, whereas with an essay or something that's a little bit more subjective and less tangible, it's harder to measure. So I do think that that's why people like to take a look at tests and see how their students are progressing. So first, we're going to dive into the SAT. What does SAT stand for? Absolutely nothing. It used to stand for Scholastic Admissions Test or Scholastic Assessment Test. It actually means nothing now. The acronym is, meaningless. And I think that's somewhat reflective of what's going on in the testing world lately. So here's a breakdown of the test by section, by question, by timing. Please don't feel like you need to memorize this or write all of this down. This is readily available for you on any practice test that you might take. It's also available on the College Board website, so you can take a peek there. What I do want to point out to you is the structure overall. Now, this is under standard time and conditions. So this is for students who are taking the test on one of the national testing days without any sort of accommodations like extended time. You start off with a reading section. The majority of the reading section is nonfiction. This is the comprehension portion where students are asked to read passages and to draw conclusions, make inferences, understand vocabulary as it appears in context. It is 65 minutes long, which is quite a long time to have to focus and then answer questions. And it's 52 questions spread among 5 passages. After the reading section, students move along to writing and language, which is basically English grammar and punctuation and conventions of standard written English. This is 35 minutes and it's 44 questions spread among 4 passages. This asks you things like, is the semicolon being used properly? Or is this the most effective and the clearest way to state something? So there is an aspect of rhetoric in there as well. After the writing and language section, students move on to the math sections. Now keep in mind, and we'll get into this in the next couple of slides a little bit more, there is a reading and writing portion score and then a math portion score of the SAT. So after the writing and language, students move on to section 3, which is math with no calculator. It's 25 minutes long, so it allows more than a minute per question. There are 20 questions. And finally, the last section is section 4. It is the math with calculator section, where students are encouraged to use a graphing calculator or something of that nature to help them through the 38 questions that are given in the 55 minutes. Now, one thing I want to highlight with the SAT is that it allows, on average, more than 1 minute per question, even under standard time and conditions. And as we go into the SAT in just a moment, you'll see that the ACT is much faster paced. There are more questions within a shorter period of time. So let's take a look and see how the ACT stacks up compared to the SAT. I'm just going to move ahead here. Okay, the ACT is similar in that it does cover English reading and math, but as you'll notice, there's also a science portion, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So the ACT, under standard time and conditions, averages less than a minute per question. It is very fast paced. So it rewards students who are fast readers, students who can process a lot of information and pull information from data analysis within, a pretty tight time constraint. It does test things on a more superficial level than the SAT does. And that is the notion as to why the ACT allows less time per question. The questions are more straightforward. So students start off with the English section, which is almost identical in terms of how the questions are written to the writing and language portion of the SAT. It asks students about punctuation, effective writing. It's 45 minutes with 75 questions, so clearly less than a minute per question. Next, students have the math section. The math section is 60 minutes for 60 questions. Students are allowed to use the calculator during the entire math portion. And if you recall, that's a little bit different from the SAT, where there was a no calculator portion. Then students move on to the reading section. It is short. It is 35 minutes, and it has 40 questions spread among 4 passages. Again, the majority of the passages are nonfiction. So really a good way for students to prepare for both the ACT and the SAT is to read challenging journals, read the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, read National Geographic. It has great graphics in it that students actually may encounter on some of these tests where there's charts and students are asked to do some data interpretation. Finally, students enter the science section. That is also quite short at 35 minutes with 40 questions. I am a former English teacher, and I have to say that I love the science section. It is very logical, and for about 90% of the questions, the answer is somewhere in front of the students. It's probably embedded in a chart or a graph. The students just need to find where that answer is. Only about 5 out of the 40 questions require science, knowledge, and recollection. So it is really a manageable section. I know sometimes students are intimidated when they hear science, but we almost view it as more of a verbal exercise in that students are required to read, make logical deductions, and move quickly through it. At the end of the ACT, there is an essay that is optional. Students would have to register to take that when they are signing up to take the ACT. We don't really talk about the essay. Very few colleges, I want to say 3 or fewer, actually want an essay score. So we don't even recommend for the vast majority of students that they concern themselves with the essay or that they spend time preparing for it. Now, one thing I do want to mention is I got to kind of address the elephant in the room. As you may have heard, the PSAT and the SAT are going digital. So the information that I gave you on the previous slide about the SAT pertains to the paper and pencil version of the test, not the digital exam. The PSAT is launching in its digital form this fall in the US, and it will be launching as an SAT next March, so about a year from now in 2024 in the US. So let's talk about scoring on these 2 tests and how you can kind of compare them. The ACT is scored on a scale of 1 through 36. So what that means is students get a composite average of those 4 sections that are required: the English, math, reading, and science. They get a 1 through 36 on each of those 4 sections, and then their score is averaged for a composite score. The national average composite score is somewhere around a 19 to a 20. The SAT is scaled on 200 to 800 per section for a total possible score of 1,600. So 200 to 800 for the math section and 200 to 800 for the reading and writing section. The national average for the SAT is currently around a 1040. And so one of the things we talk about is students need to figure out which test they will excel further at, which test they feel is more comfortable, which test do they think they can improve upon more. So one of the things that we recommend that students do is you take a free practice test of both the ACT and the SAT, and then you look at one of these concordance charts, which are freely available on the internet, and see which score is higher and use that in your consideration as to which test you want to move forward with. I'm going to say this once and I'll probably say it several more times because it's so important. The ACT and the SAT are equally accepted at American colleges. There's no preference of one test over the other. So that's why we do suggest that students take the test and move forward with the one that feels more comfortable to them. When are the tests? Right now, the tests are offered nationally each 7 times per year. So you can see the ACT months and then the SAT months. They will not be offered the same date if they are both offered in the same month. So for example, December, there's both an ACT and an SAT. They are on separate Saturdays, typically. Now, some schools do have their own administrations. We call it school day administration, where they will offer one of these tests for free during the school day. And we do recommend that students take advantage of that because it is a good exercise. Now, I talked about the full-length ACT and the SAT. What about the PSAT and pre-ACT? These do exist. The PSAT is the shorter version of the SAT, and then there's a pre-ACT, which is a shorter version of the actual ACT. We find that the PSAT is much more common than is the pre-ACT. The PSAT in my area in New Jersey is typically offered in 10th grade as simply a practice test, and then again in 11th grade where it counts for National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. That's what the PSAT and MSQT is. Now, the PSAT, because it's shorter and has fewer questions, is only on a scale of 160 to 760, as opposed to the full-length SAT, which is 200 to 800 per section. So the highest a student can get on a PSAT is a 1520. Similarly, the ACT is scored on a lower scale, not that much lower, but it's from 1 to 35 as opposed to 1 through 36. The pre-ACT doesn't count for any scholarship money or anything. So the pre-ACT is truly simply a practice test. And we noticed that some schools do offer both a PSAT and a pre-ACT, so students can compare them using one of those concordance charts. The PSAT and pre-ACT are somewhat indicative of how students will perform on the actual exams because they do try to be vertically aligned, certainly with the PSAT, but we have noticed that sometimes there are some discrepancies. Just for the nature that the SAT and the ACT, the full-length tests, are simply longer, and so they require students to focus for a longer duration. Finding the best fit exam. I did speak a little bit about this earlier. We do not recommend that students prepare for both the SAT and the ACT. The pacing is so different. And students who take both tests say they just feel different, even if they can't necessarily articulate why. So the SAT, we say, is for people who like to problem solve. They like to mull over questions. That's why there's a lot of time given per question. They like deductive reasoning and inference. Sometimes there are even these 2-part questions. They're called evidence-based reading questions that can be quite challenging in that they ask students to list where they found their answers. The ACT is good for students who are fast-paced and who don't have an issue with finishing time within a certain period, finishing the test within a certain period of time, I should say. Because the SAT does allow more time per question, it's slower, more relaxed. The ACT, like I said, it's faster, but it's much more superficial and doesn't require as much deductive reasoning and inference. So I wanted to touch upon a couple of myths that I often hear from families There is not an easier test date administration. The tests are what they call normed or equalized, so that a student who takes the SAT in December can be compared with a student who takes the SAT in June. It's basically a curve. The organizations do not call it that, but that's essentially what it is. Students don't necessarily need to be scoring at the 99th percentile to get into a school or to use a score. And that's why we said, number two, I need a 1500 in order to get in anywhere. Some schools, you don't even need a test score. Those schools are the test-free schools. I mentioned that colleges really don't care to see both tests. That's why they're equally accepted, and we recommend that students plan to stick with one. We always recommend that students plan to take the same test, so the SAT or the ACT, for multiple administrations, because it makes sense. Students become better as they take it more frequently. There is research that also shows the majority of students who repeat test tend to go up. And then lastly, I know when I was growing up here in New Jersey, there was this notion that, oh, I take my PSAT score and I add 100 points on it, and that's what I'll get on my SAT. That is not the case. When the SAT was redesigned back in 2016, the PSAT was vertically aligned with the SAT, so that if a student got an 1100 on the PSAT, that would be the same as if they had taken the SAT that day and scored an 1100. So how do students prepare for these exams if they choose to move forward with them? There are some things that we recommend that you take into consideration and keep in mind, I should say, whether you are working with us or you're exploring and doing your due diligence and looking at other organizations. We say that good test prep takes the long view. It doesn't just necessarily teach to the test. So when I teach students grammar, I try to give them the context, like, you're going to be using grammar probably in college. You know, your professors are going to be judging your writing. If you have to write a lot of essays, you might even be judged in the business world if you have to write an email or a memo. So you want to make sure that your grammar is sound. We also say that about math, like Algebra 2. Algebra 2 is a really important math in multiple disciplines, whether students are studying economics, health, business. Algebra 2 and reading XY coordinates and graphs is kind of a fundamental math, and so it is very important. Other things to keep in mind: good test prep should not just teach the tricks, but also teach the content. You kind of need to layer them both to maximize and optimize your test score. Good test prep begins well in advance. These are not tests that you can cram for. None of these, the ACTs, the SATs, or the AP exams. And good test prep also consists of accountability and consistency. And that's where a coach or a student group or a tutor or a class can help students keep them on track and, you know, just hold them accountable to doing their practice. Good test prep also teaches critical thinking and problem solving, again, skills that students will be using in college and beyond. And good test prep doesn't just wash, rinse, and repeat. So one of the things that I try to point out when I'm doing consultations with families is that we do not recommend that students take a 3.5-hour test every week in the 3 months leading up to their exam. What's much more effective might be something like taking one full-length exam a month and making sure that a student is reviewing it thoroughly, both the answers they got wrong and the answers they got right, to ensure that they got the right questions right for the right reasons and they're not just really good guessers, although that does help sometimes. So here are some free and helpful resources. Both the College Board, those are the makers of the SAT and the AP test and the PSAT, and the ACT company release official material. So currently what we use with students are those official study guides that are put out by the respective test makers. The SAT book is put out by the College Board, and then the ACT book is put out by the ACT company. There's also a wonderful resource in Khan Academy, whether you're studying for the ACT or the SAT. Khan Academy actually partnered with the College Board so that if students have official PSAT or SAT scores, they can link those through their College Board account to Khan Academy online and get free recommendations in terms of exercises and timelines that they should be doing. So the Khan Academy is a fantastic resource. It's a kind of microburst learning where the students can watch a 6-minute video and then complete a few questions regarding it. There's also free resources available at the respective test makers' websites, sat.org and act.org. That's where students go to register for these exams. But there are also test prep resources on those sites in the form of free questions, free tests, and so on. So I'm just going to briefly touch on AP exams. We're actually heading into AP season, meaning that the tests are coming up in May and June. They are subject specific. So you may know that there are AP advanced languages. So there's a Spanish test, there's Italian, French. There are a vast variety of STEM programs. So there's physics, chemistry, bio, Calculus AB, Calculus BC, and then there's also history exams. These are typically tests that students have been preparing for throughout the school year by completing coursework. So we do recommend if students are taking an AP test, an AP course, then they should probably sit for that AP test. Otherwise, there are times where that can raise a red flag with some schools. But we also recommend that students feel prepared for these tests. So again, students might want to determine what type of prep might be most appropriate for them, whether it's one-on-one, a small group class, in person, virtual. We actually offer a bunch of mini courses. They are meant to be review of the material and test taking tips. They are not meant to be the content itself, because hopefully students have kind of been working on that throughout their academic year. There are some AP exams that are offered both in the digital and the paper and pencil form. That depends on which exam it is and also whether the school is offering it or not. And like I said, those are typically offered in May and June at the end of the academic year, assuming that students have been covering the material leading up to that exam. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Nichelle, who's going to go over a testing timeline should students be pursuing these exams.
Thank you. So I just want to say there are students of varying ages on this call. So I'm going to be speaking to people at different points of their educational journey. What that means is everyone's testing timeline will be a little bit different. So please don't feel panicked if yours doesn't align precisely with what I'm recommending here. We'll go to the next slide. So now I want to go through just some general guidelines, and then I'll do some grade specific tips that I have for each grade. But much of our guidance around test taking is dependent on your math courses. If you're taking pre-calc or a higher level math heading into your junior year, you might consider starting your studies over the summer before 11th grade and testing in the fall or winter of 11th grade. If you're taking Algebra 2 on a standard level math class, plan to focus on your coursework in the fall and then test in the spring of 11th grade. The goal is to be done with testing by the end of 11th grade, so you can spend your 12th grade fall focusing on applications in your senior year coursework. When it comes to standardized testing for colleges, there's really nothing that needs to be happening during freshman year. Next slide, Stephanie. You should be enjoying your freshman year, learning how to be a high school student, getting involved in activities, meeting new people, working hard in your classroom, and having fun. Learn how to study and perform well on school tests, but do not make the focus of freshman year anything to do with college admissions. Next slide. Sophomore year, most schools are going to offer the PSAT. There's really no reason to prepare here for the PSAT. This is just a practice test. It's a chance for you to get familiar with what it's like and see your areas of natural strengths and areas of improvement. Results come back from the PSAT in December. And if you'd like to, you can take a diagnostic full-length SAT or practice ACT with Collegewise or other places to compare your results between the PSAT and the SAT, just as Stephanie was saying, to see which one sort of feels better and might be a better fit for you. Junior year is when you'll take the PSAT again, and this time it can count for the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. That happens typically in the fall of junior year, and then after that is when you'll really start your testing plan. So either taking an official SAT or ACT at the end of your spring semester, once or twice of junior year, and then the idea would be to be done testing by the end of junior year, if possible. Don't panic though, because you can still take a test fall of senior year if needed. But also consider definitely taking any AP exams if you are registered for any AP classes. These exams can give you the option to get college credit, and there's really no harm in taking them at all because most colleges do not use AP scores as part of their application review process. Seniors, as you progress through your testing timeline, you should plan, like I said, to have your final tests done by October of senior year. Most students may be applying to schools with a November 1 or November 30th deadline. And so that October test may be the last test that the results are available to send to those early schools. Word to the wise, too, senior year grades still matter. College admissions officers want to know that you're carrying your academic momentum throughout your senior year, showing engagement in those classes and pursuing academic rigor. So try your very, very hardest not to get that senioritis. Okay, so how do colleges view the SAT? And that is going to vary between schools. So it's important to check on the testing policies of each individual school to know exactly what they're looking for. In the following slides, we're going to dive a little deeper into what each of the testing policies mean, but just know that generally, colleges understand that 4 years of a student's academic achievements are much more important than what happened in a 3-hour test in a gym one Saturday. While some schools will require testing and consider it as part of the student's application, it rarely makes or breaks a student's decision. So let's define what some of these different terms mean. Test optional truly means optional. You can submit a test score to the school if you have one that you're proud of, or you do not have to submit a test score. If you don't submit a test score, there is no penalization for that. That is just one factor that has been removed from your overall application review, and they will look at everything else in your application equally. Test blind or test free means that the school will not review your test scores, even if you tried to submit them. They will never be seen by the admissions office. Test flexible means that the school may allow you to waive the testing requirement, but you have to supply something else. So perhaps an interview or write an extra essay or submit a graded paper if you are not going to be submitting test scores. And then test required means just that you are required to submit standardized test scores in order for your application to be evaluated. Now, over the last couple of years, COVID has had an effect on these testing requirements at various colleges. Before COVID, there were around 1,000 schools that were considered test optional, and now it's closer to 2,000 schools are test optional. So it's really important to check the school's language around testing, even if they are test optional. Many of the schools during COVID entered into a trial period of being test optional, which meant that they're going to reevaluate their policies after a certain period of time, usually 3 or 5 years. So even if a school right now is test optional for the seniors, if there's a sophomore or freshman on the class, the school may be reevaluating their policy at that point. And something to note too is some schools still require test scores for certain scholarships, even if the school is test optional for admissions purposes. So if you are hoping for merit aid, it may be beneficial for you to submit test scores, even if the school is test optional. And some schools that have GPA requirements for students who are going test optional. So for example, you'd have to have a 3.5 GPA in order to have the test score requirement waived. But if you were an under 3.5, then they would require testing. So like everything college admissions related, it really depends school by school. So once you have a finalized list of colleges where you're applying, this is important to check each school individually. Okay, when to submit test scores. There's lots to consider here. You want to check out the school's testing policy either on their website, or there's a great website, fairtest.org, that has all of this information. Oftentimes, we recommend that students look at the middle 50% for accepted students' test scores. And then if your score is above the median 50th percentile for the range of accepted students at that school, we would recommend, yes, that you submit scores. But that's really going to vary case by case. And it is appropriate to ask the admissions officer at the school in which you're applying for advice on if it would be helpful for you to submit your test scores. Okay, next slide. I just want to say that the test, as Stephanie mentioned, ACT and SAT literally stand for nothing. So the name Scholastic Assessment Test or American College Test has been dropped. And I think that's really symbolic, just as she mentioned. There are human beings reading your application, and they are much more interested in the other things you have to share than just these test scores. While it's true that these scores at some schools can play a role in the admissions process, please know that coming from someone who's read thousands of applications, they were never the main focus in our discussion of a student's candidacy. You are more than your test scores, and admissions readers know that. Okay, so before we launch into questions, we are going to put up one more poll. And I just want to remind everybody, while you're doing the poll, we have some great continually updated news and resources for you on our website, and you can get more information at the link there. And we have tutors and counselors ready to work with your students online for homework help, study skills, and staying fresh on the SAT or ACT preparation. And finally, we're recording this, so you will receive an email with a link to the recording, along with a link to schedule a phone call with one of our program advisors or test prep experts if you're interested.
I'm just going to keep that up there for a few more moments before we get into questions. While I'm doing that, I just wanted to mention something too about the PSAT, because I kind of went through that a bit quickly. National merit depends upon the state in which a student lives. There are certain cutoff requirements. National merit finalist status is state by state, but then there's also a commended status, which is typically lower than the state requirement. And again, that's for the PSAT and MSQT, which is in 11th grade. If you're interested in finding out more, I would encourage you to speak with your counseling office at your school and see kind of what the score has typically been for students who are finalists. The PSAT is not typically used for admissions purposes because it's not on a transcript. All right, so it looks like we have some questions. Thank you for completing that poll. And we just wanted to also say thank you for spending time with us here. I'm going to hop out of the deck, and Nichelle and I will be able to answer some of your questions live in just a moment. Great. So we have a question here. Can we talk about super scoring in general? What happens if you want to save your energy for one portion? Would it be a good strategy to just focus on getting a better score on one part of the test? I can handle that first. So super scoring, if you don't know what that is, that means that, for example, a student did really well in October on the SAT math section. And then they took it again in December and they did really well on the reading and writing section. So what the student can do is use the highest score from the respective section and put them together to create what's called a super score. Super scoring policy depends upon the school itself. So that's one of the things you can take a look at and see if they do engage in super scoring. A lot of schools do something called self-reporting, where when students are completing the common application, they are asked to submit their scores. And only once they're admitted, then are they required to submit the actual official score report. And some of the schools ask for your highest score in each section, or some of the schools just ask for all of your tests. That is really, really rare. I think there's only a couple of schools that want to see all of your test scores. Generally, they do, ask you to report your highest, or they'll super score themselves. Nichelle, did you want to add anything on to super scoring?
No, you covered it.
Okay. Now let's take a look here. How can you prep for the ACT for free through Khan or elsewhere? It's not totally for free, but that ACT official study guide has 6 released exams in it. And I want to say that the book costs about $35. I do think that's a good place for students to start getting official practice, meaning it's released from the official test maker. Students who are savvy with Google can also often find released exams. But I do think it's wise to, decide whether a student's going to move forward with self-study where they're preparing on their own, or with a tutor. It's just wise to have a plan, and again, to sit for that test for 2 administrations. I believe on the ACT website as well, act.org, they have a loose partnership with one of our competitors that I used to work for, Kaplan Test Prep. So there are some low cost or free videos and resources in there as well. But I do think that Khan Academy is applicable to both tests. So for example, punctuation rules, when you use a semicolon, doesn't matter which test you're taking, the rules are the same. So students can do exercises in grammar, or like on the quadratic formula for math, and the content that they review from that would be applicable towards the ACT or the SAT. Nichelle, there's a question about PSAT timeline. Do you want to take that one, or do you want to talk about AP exams?
I'm happy to talk about both, but the question I'm looking at right now asks if your high school doesn't offer AP exams, should you take it also, should you find a place to take it? And the answer there is you are going to be evaluated at the colleges based on your individual context. So they're going to look at the opportunities that you've taken advantage of as to what was available to you. So if your high school does not offer AP classes or AP exams, your student would never be expected to have those. In some cases, I have had students who've taken AP exams at other high schools that have offered it. If their curriculum completely aligned with the AP curriculum, in some cases it does not align. And so then the student may not be successful on that AP test. So I would recommend talking to the teachers in whatever subjects you're thinking about and seeing if the student's actually learning the proper content before making that final decision.
Yeah, did you want to read one?
Yeah, which one was the one about the timeline of the PSAT? I'm sorry.
Sure. It says questions about the PSAT, SAT timeline. Number 1, should my students skip the PSAT and go straight to SAT if they are already through Algebra 2? I have some thoughts about that, but if you want to speak to that, you can.
I would say there's no harm in taking the PSAT. It is a great additional practice test and will only help in the long run with your overall test prep.
And I would emphasize it's a very low stakes exam. As I mentioned, the colleges typically don't see that on the transcript. The other reason I do think it's a good idea to take it, especially for sophomores this year and juniors, of course, the PSAT this coming October will be offered digitally. And I think that's really good practice if students are considering taking the digital SAT. It will be almost exactly the same format of the digital SAT that's going to be launching in the US about a year from now. now. And then the second part of this question, was there any harm in skipping the PSAT entirely? I would say if it's being offered for free at your school, take advantage of it. Michelle,
Yeah,
did you
there's
have
no
any thoughts?
harm. Nobody's going to know you didn't take it. So as far as that goes, if you're on vacation that day or something and you can't sit for it, no big deal. But if you could do it, why not?
Yeah, agreed. And I do think it's good also for students to build up that test taking stamina that we often talk about. A lot of students during COVID learning, remote learning, didn't have to sit for a long duration and focus and answer questions. So I think any exercise that gets you to start building up that ability to sit for 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours is worthwhile. There's a question here about AP exams. I think actually this may be more of a counseling type of question. AP exams. Why might not taking the AP exam raise any red flags? Could you retake the AP exam if you don't do well? Do you have any thoughts on that, Nichelle?
So this is nuanced. Some high schools, if you're registered for an AP class, if you're in the class, they require you to take the AP exam. Other high schools don't. You have the option of registering for it or not. Generally speaking, I think there is no harm in taking the AP exam, even if you end up scoring lower than you would like. You do not have to report those scores to any of the colleges during your application process. So it's sort of like you prepared all year long to take this test, just sit for it and see what happens. That's my general rule of thumb as far as that goes. Yeah, if you choose not to report the score, the college won't know whether you took it or not. They're not going to automatically assume you took it and did poorly. They just don't use that information in the application review process.
The second part of that, could you retake the AP exam if you don't do well?
They're only offered once a year, so you may be able to, but it would be a whole year later, and you wouldn't remember all of the stuff you wouldn't do as well as you would the year you're taking the course.
Agreed. Yeah. The next question I'll take, is there a limit on the number of times students can take the ACT or SAT? How does this reflect in the application process? So I think I looked this up, and I want to say that there is a limit of 12 times that you can take the ACT. And I would say to a student, why are you taking the ACT 12 times? The SAT, I believe there's no limit on, but again, students usually max out around their third time, maybe fourth in some unusual cases. Some students max out at their second time, and then it becomes diminishing returns, right? Law of diminishing returns. Students get test taking burnout. We often joke and say, don't let test prep be an extracurricular activity. Really, again, it's such a small piece of the application process. I think students should be encouraged to pursue things that are more interesting to college admissions, readers and representatives, whether that's pursuing, a musical instrument or learning a new language. In terms of how does this reflect in the application process? Again, there are very few schools that want to see all of your test scores, but I do think if you had to if you were required to submit all of your test scores and you had taken the SAT 12 times, a college might not look so favorably on that. But again, very, very few schools require you to submit all of your scores. Did you want to add on to that from an admissions perspective, Nichelle?
No, you hit it all, Stephanie.
Okay. Next, this one's for you. Do admissions counselors really ignore the fact that you don't submit scores? And then follow up, how do they not assume you got below the 50% so you didn't submit?
Yeah, they really becomes a non-factor in your application review. So they're looking holistically at the application, your grades and courses you've taken are always number one most important thing in any application review. And that's what they're going to take their information on your academic ability. And that like small piece of the pie that might have been test scores is just pulled out, and the other sections become a little bit bigger. They cannot make assumptions about what a student may or may not have scored. That's completely against the review process. It is just becomes a non-factor.
Thanks. I'm going to answer a question here specific about the SAT and the questions. Are all the answers on the SAT weighed the same number of points for each question? That is a great question. So on the ACT and the SAT, the questions are equally weighted, whether they're easy, medium, or difficult, as categorized by the test makers. And there is no guessing penalty. So students should try to get as many correct answers as possible. And what that means is students might be guessing. We recommend that students put an answer for every question. Even on the SAT, there are those math grid-ins where students actually have to produce the answer. Here's a little trick. Try the number 2 as a tutor and as a member of different tutoring groups. We have noticed that the number 2 has popped up as a correct answer at least once on almost every released SAT in the math grid-in portion. So that's just a little tip. And those are the types of tricks that tutors, like if you work with one of our tutors, they can give students. There's another digital SAT question. Let me take a look at this. I've heard the new digital SAT is changing format. If you do well in one section, the next section gets harder and vice versa. Is this true? Yes, it is true. The new digital SAT is going to be section adaptive, which means how a student performs on the first easier section, for example, in the reading and writing, determines the next reading and writing section. If they do really well on that first section, they will get a harder section, which means that they can score higher. If they don't do so well on that first easier section, they will get bumped down to a lower adaptation of that section, and their scores can only hit a certain maximum. The next part of this is also, are all the questions on the SAT weighed the same number of points for each question? So currently on the paper and pencil version, yes, they are weighted the same. When we move to digital SAT, that will change, because in essence, the first sections are weighted more in that they determine the next section. In the spring, we will probably be doing some webinars specific to the digital SAT and the digital PSATs. So if you'd like to follow us, you'll probably see when we start releasing those. I think in May, we'll be doing some webinars about this. Any other questions? Let me see here. How long after taking an SAT test do the scores become available? Well, it's a lot different from when I took the SAT. We used to wait 6 to 8 weeks for a big envelope in the mail. That is no longer the case. For both the ACT and the SAT, they turn around in about 2 business weeks. When the SAT and the PSAT move to their digital form, it will probably even be faster than that, within a matter of days. And then let me see another question here. Are there any study aids or resources available for a student who needs help in mathematics, algebra, that they can leverage to clear concepts before actual test prep? So doing schoolwork and doing well in students' classes is probably the best way to prepare for the math portion of these exams. That said, some students do need extra help and tutoring, and then just really need to focus on the style of questions that they might be presented with on the ACT and the SAT. There are certainly a ton of resources out there. Some of them are great. Some of them are not so great, but that's something that, like, a tutor will, whether it's us or somebody else, or that a school's teacher who offers office hours, might be able to guide a student towards more resources that can bolster their performance in math. And we do offer those free diagnostic tests. We proctor them remotely, and our score turnaround for those is also about 2 business weeks. And we will actually make recommendations based upon a student's performance on those diagnostics as to which tests they should take, when they should take those tests, and what type of preparation in terms of hours, how many hours do they probably need to work with a tutor for the ACT or the SAT. Here's another question. If a university, and I think this is for you, Nichelle, if a university expects you to send in all of your SAT scores, will they let you know that on their website?
Yes, they will. They're very clear about their testing policies on their website. Most schools let you pick and choose which test dates you would like to send, but there are a few that like to see every single score, and they will let you know.
Yep. And then we have a lot more questions about the digital test. So just again, to give the general timeline, the PSAT this October for students will be the digital format. So that is basically the same format as the digital SAT. That will be launched in the US in March of 2024. So the paper and pencil SAT will be offered throughout the rest of this year through the December administration. The December administration will be the last offering of the paper and pencil test for the SAT on a large scale. Then they are moving to digital. That said, if a student gets accommodations where they are required to complete a paper and pencil test, that will continue to be honored. In that case, the test would be linear. It wouldn't be adaptive because it is a paper and pencil test, and the questions, that are in the test booklet are the questions that are in the test book. They're not going to change based upon a student's performance. And yes, there is really good information on the College Board website. I think Allie just dropped the link in there. Thank you, Allie, for doing that. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and to, keep an eye out for when we're going to be offering our digital webinars in the spring. And then we've got some other questions here. Let's take a look. Nichelle, I'm going to give this one to you, if you can. What advice, and I think this is nuanced again, what advice would you give students who are taking 5 or more AP tests a year?
That's a lot of tests, but you've already done all the hard work, which is take the AP courses throughout the entire year. So I feel like you're going to be as well prepared as you possibly can. Depending on your high school, I have known some high schools that allow kids to miss their other classes when they have so many exams. So that might be something that's worth asking. Get lots of sleep, eat well, and try your best.
Yeah, I think that's it. And just plan, and allow yourself some buffer time when you're planning your studies so that if things don't go to plan, which they normally don't, right? Every now and then there's a little hiccup in the system. That doesn't affect the overall studying plan so much. I also encourage students when they're studying for these higher stakes exams to take one day a week. I know we're preparing a lot like every day, but to take one day a week where you have a cognitive break and you really don't focus on these exams at all. So when I'm working with students on ACT and SAT prep, I say, give yourself either a Saturday or Sunday where you're not doing preparation for this test and go be a teenager for a while and don't worry about it that much. And there is research that shows we do need breaks in order to retain material. One last question, I think this might be it. What is the latest test that 12th graders can take in time for admissions? I think, Nichelle, you had spoken about this briefly. Can you dive into that a little bit more?
It depends, right? It depends on what schools that they're applying to and what the application deadlines are for those particular schools. If a student is applying to the majority of their schools with regular decision deadlines, which is in January, they could take the test all the way up through December of their senior year. That's probably the most common answer to this question. However, there are schools that are on rolling admissions that, a student could apply to much later their senior year, and perhaps a later test date would work. I would not recommend that. My recommendation would be to be done testing by December of your senior year.
Great, thanks so much. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up. Thank you everyone so much for being so engaged and for giving us your time during the week. We know that everybody's busy and we so appreciate that. Stay on the lookout for your recording in the next couple of days. That should be emailed to you. Nichelle, did you have anything else you wanted to mention?
No, thank you. It was nice to spend the evening with everyone.
Thanks everyone. Take care.